Hey everyone, welcome to another interview with some friends of mine. It's International Firefighters Day, and thanks so much to the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation for hosting these discussions. I'm excited because this morning's or today's interview, depending upon when you're watching this, is one of my absolute favorite people in the fire service. Uh, while we're not close personal friends, although if I lived near him, I imagine we would be, at least I'd hound him to be my close personal friend, because I have the deepest respect for Chief Ken Stuebing. Not only do I enjoy his humor, but I enjoy his no nonsense, high integrity leadership, unlike that we find very often, unfortunately, these days in the fire service. But we are getting better. And as we see people rise through the ranks, we see more and more phenomenal leaders moving their way up. And Ken is absolutely at the top of that chain. Ken is the acting president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs. And Ken will go into his full presidency this summer. We're very excited about that. Ken and I got to become friends by my and his role of sitting on the IAFC board of directors and International Association of Fire Chiefs related activities. And I immediately was taken to Ken based upon my observations of him functioning in those leadership roles. And I'm so thrilled that he's got the time to join us in today's discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about Ken and his history and background. Ken has been on the job for over 30 years, working with both career and volunteer fire and emergency services throughout Canada. Since 2017, Ken has been the fire chief of Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency Services in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada. Ken also, as I mentioned, serves as the acting president of the IAFC. Ken began his career as a paramedic in 1984 and worked in all types of emergency services across Canada. In 1988, he became a career firefighter with the City of Kitchener Fire Department. He was promoted to captain as soon as he was able to work his way up that ladder. After serving as a captain for almost 6 years, he accepted the Assistant Chief of Operations role with the Winnipeg Fire Paramedic Service in 2006, and that's one organization, Winnipeg Fire Paramedic Service. And in 2007, Ken was promoted to Deputy Fire Chief, or as I guess they would say, Deputy Chief of Professional Development for that department. After serving almost 8 years in Winnipeg, Chief Stuebing accepted the fire chief's position in 2013 with the Chatham-Kent Fire and Emergency Services, and his title there was actually Fire Chief and Chief Paramedic as well. So he oversaw both fire and EMS in Chatham-Kent. And then in 2017, he went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, as the fire chief there. Ken holds a bachelor's degree in health services and sciences with Charles Sturt University in Australia, a master's certificate in municipal leadership with York University in Toronto, a diploma from Seneca College and certificate from Conestoga College in aeromedical and ambulance and emergency care, respectively. And I am so thrilled to have my friend, and I'm telling you, I don't say this a lot about people. If you listen to some of my podcasts and shows, you won't hear me often speak of someone in the highest regard that I do of Ken Stuebing. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. Very kind words. What an honor to be with you here today. And I think the respect is absolutely mutual. Although you and I got a chance to know each other much, much better when we served on the board. Like many firefighters, I knew about you long before you knew about me. So highly regard the work you do on behalf of the firefighters across North America and internationally as well. So what an honor and privilege to be with you here today. Thank you for your kind words.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm a huge Canada fan. I love coming up. I've had numerous opportunities to be invited by the Canadian Fire Service to spend time up there, and I really do enjoy that and getting to know you through the IFC and watching you operate. For those who are joining us today who are members of the IFC, you're in for a very, very positive and exciting time as Ken continues to lead the IFC. So, Ken, how did you become involved in the fire service? Were you just riding your bicycle one day and saw an ambulance or fire truck go by, or what's the history there?
Thanks for the question. Been certainly asked this in the past. I would say I had a atypical transition into emergency services compared to stories I've heard where people grew up wanting to be a firefighter their whole life. That was certainly not the way it happened for me. Although, a high regard for all emergency services as a youngster, my father owned a family business in skilled trades, and that was actually fire sprinkler installation. So I grew up in the family business, so to speak, and did skilled trades. But that was back in the 80s, and in Canada the economy was tough in the 80s. So I eventually, after kind of flipping from skilled trade to skilled trade, had enough hours to do my journeyman certification as a pipe fitter. I did some time in tin whacking and plumbing as well. I decided to go back to school to get something that would be a little bit more stable for family life. So and again, I didn't think about this in high school because I was fully planning to stay in the family business. So I had to really think about what I wanted to go back for school to do. And I had been a lifeguard. I was avidly involved in sports. One of those sports was swimming. That led to getting my lifeguard certification. And I did some summers as a lifeguard. So I thought, that seemed to be a pretty good gig. Paramedic is, I would think, close to being a lifeguard. So I went to school to be a paramedic, worked for a few years as a paramedic. And back then in the late 80s, fire services in Ontario were getting very involved in tiered response calls. So they were looking for people with medical backgrounds. So I applied. My skilled trades, I think, was helpful in transitioning into the fire service as well, but certainly was my medical background. So eventually I went from being a full-time paramedic to being a full-time firefighter, and progressed through the ranks like you outlined. So that was my role into the fire service, maybe a little bit atypical. It came from the skilled trades as opposed to somebody who grew up their whole time wanting to be a firefighter. I certainly had some family members, uncle that was very close who was in the fire service and strongly encouraged me when I started asking some questions about it to pursue it, and certainly no looking back now.
Clearly, no looking back. So you spent time as a volunteer, and was that while you were working in the trades, or while you were in school, or what did you do then?
So never had been a volunteer firefighter myself, volunteered in the medical roles in many different organizations. So, doing community events, staffing first aid booths, involved with the volunteer ski patrol, St. John's ambulance. But when I worked in some of the organizations I worked in, both as a paramedic and as a firefighter, worked very closely with volunteer firefighters. So I'll give you an example. When I worked in Northern Ontario as a full-time paramedic, we staffed the unit Monday through Friday, kind of typically 9 to 5. And then after the end of the workday, so there'd be two paramedics working on the ambulance, we'd go park the ambulance for the evening, and one of those individuals who was on duty, and I was one of them, would take a pager home. And if a call came in after hours, we would go back out on the ambulance, and we were typically teamed up with another member. So although I was a career paramedic, I would go back on call, so to speak. That was part of my job expectation. And at night, I would respond with a volunteer. And that volunteer would a lot of times be a volunteer firefighter. So they were a volunteer firefighter and a volunteer paramedic.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, interesting model. So I grew up very closely connected. When I say grew up, I grew up in my trade. evolved through my work experience, working very closely with volunteers and understanding the importance they play in the model.
That's interesting. I'm glad you brought it up. One of my pursuits right now is sharing with all volunteer services their options as they change, because throughout North America, United States, and Canada, we're seeing significant struggles with the volunteer fire service. And there are numerous unique models that can be applied, and that's certainly an interesting example. So let's talk about your current department, because that could evolve into some discussion for those that are interested in volunteer fire and rescue services. So tell us about your department. I know that there's a terrible history there with an explosion, and you can share that with our audience. And kind of tell us about that, and tell us about the department today. What are your challenges, and just kind of the visiting firefighter kind of snapshot of your organization.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit of information about this incredible department made up of incredible individuals. So, first thing, we're the oldest fire service in Canada. So certainly some pride and history there. In 1917, over 100 years ago. So I started here on the 100th anniversary of the explosion. So this department, unfortunately, had a huge loss of life during what's known as the Halifax Explosion. So in 1917, two ships collided in the harbor. One of those ships was a munition vessel, which exploded the ordnance and basically flattened a huge portion of the city. The city was very closely built around the harbor. And if you see the harbor, which you can see over my shoulder, the banks come down to the water. And that explosion was just amplified coming out of the harbor and literally devastated a large portion of the city, flattened a big portion of the city. And at the time, until the Second World War, it was the largest man-made explosion in the world. So it had some huge devastating effects on the city. And it shortly thereafter, within 24 hours, I believe, there was a large snowfall. So a lot of people were trapped under rubble, buildings were flattened. Obviously, in 1917, it wasn't as easy to get around as it is today. Very shortly thereafter, the city of Boston came to our aid. So the cities have a close kin relationship, which is really cool. I've learned a lot about Canadian history having taken on this post, and that cool relationship between Halifax and Boston. The other unique thing that people might not be aware of here is that still serves as the largest loss of life for a fire service in Canada, where we lost 8 firefighters during that response. So they responded to the pier for a fire, and the crew that responded, 8 firefighters, including the chief and the deputy, 2 captains and 4 firefighters, were killed instantaneously. There was a few survivors in the responding crew, but certainly a large loss of life. That still stands as the largest loss of life from a single incident in the Canadian Fire Service.
You lost at that explosion, killed several thousand members of the community as well, right?
Over a couple thousand members of the community. Many people injured or severely harmed as a result of that. A large amount of people were blinded by the glass that the explosion shattered all the windows. It ended up being, one of the things that started the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. So that event, there were so many people in need of assistance after losing their eyesight. We still, to this day, have the Canadian National Institute for the Blind and the Red Cross. Those were some of the things that kind of galvanized those organizations being established and stuff.
Now, the 100th anniversary of that explosion didn't either you go, or did not Joe Finn from Boston come up, or wasn't there some sort of a
Yes.
ceremony? Yeah.
Yes. So since that horrific day over 100 years ago, there's been a tradition that Nova Scotia has maintained. So every year before the holidays, uh, an evergreen tree is transported down to Boston and stood up in Boston Commons. It ends up becoming their tree lighting, their major tree for their tree lighting for the holiday season. And that has happened every year since the explosion. So Halifax sends down the tree as a sign of recognition and thanks for the support that we got from Boston. That was part of that relationship I was talking about. And on the 100th anniversary, the tree was dedicated to first responders. So every year it's dedicated to a group of people. That particular year, it was dedicated to first responders. So I ended up accompanying the mayor here from Halifax to deliver the tree down to Boston. So I went down there with other members of our department to say thank you and to recognize first responders. And Commissioner Joe Finn and some of his team, including the now president, Ed Kelly, for the IFF, came
Sure.
to Halifax to participate in the 100th anniversary here. So, it ended up starting me. So this was literally, I was only on the job for a couple of weeks, right? And, I get a chance to meet Commissioner Joe Finn. And, at the time, Ed Kelly was in another position, but certainly Ed Kelly and our union and our honor guard members in a major anniversary recognition here in Halifax, and then go down and dedicate the tree. It's certainly every year something that our department takes seriously. We have a memorial service every year on the anniversary date, but that year it was definitely special.
That's great. And another real gentleman and a superb leader, Joe Finn up in Boston, who's now since retired. And sorry about that. Good stuff. So can you tell us about your department and share us, because you really do have a very unique and diverse type of organization. And when I diverse, I don't just mean the people, but I mean the type of volunteer, career, part-time, and everything else. Tell us about your fire department. And for those joining us, note the term is Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency Services, because they cover way more than just the downtown area.
So thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit more information. So we are, you're right, a regional department. We have a very large geography, 5,500 square kilometers that we respond to. So for US terms, that's about 21, 23 square kilometers. So just over 2,100 square kilometers. That is a huge footprint. It is the size of one of our provinces. Here we have Prince Edward Island. So it is the size of Prince Edward Island that our department is solely responsible for. It is an amalgamated department. So a little bit over 2 decades ago, the province chose to amalgamate the communities in Halifax County. So, and some others. But long story short, we merged many departments and communities outside the fire service, many communities and members of various different fire departments into one regional fire service. So as such, we have, a pretty diverse geography that we respond to, and a atypical response model. So what I mean by that is we are a metropolitan department by definition. So we have over, around 500 career firefighters and, some 50 some odd full-time support members in prevention and training and logistics and administration and support. We have about 500, the numbers vary kind of day to day, anywhere from 500 to 600 volunteer firefighters as well. We do have many vacancies, so technically we have 800 volunteer positions on our books. So if you take the two, buckets of firefighters. We have over 1,000 responding firefighters. And, like many metro departments, we have 24-hour career-only stations, but we also have 24-hour composite stations where we have career and volunteers working out of the same station. We have 24-hour-a-day volunteer stations that are serviced solely by volunteers, typically out in some of our more rural areas, but not totally. And then we also have a very unique model where we have, at least in Canada, a lot more common in the States, we have staffing where we have career members kind of 10 and a half hours a day that respond with the volunteers in that station. And then after their 10 and a half hour shift, the volunteers respond in isolation. So typically those are on, not all the time, but typically they're on the fringe of the urban areas where a lot of times some of those communities, people who are our volunteer firefighters respond, go into the bigger urban footprint to do their full-time job. So the career members in those stations are there to add depth of response with the volunteers who are still in the community. So, as shared earlier, this model has been in operation for 20 years, and we continue to tweak the model. I believe I'm, probably largely because of my medical background, but I'm strongly supportive over evidence-based decision-making. So we released our first annual report this year, and we are trying to provide data and evidence on our response capabilities. We've got council's blessing on an emergency response time target and what we call an administrative order, which outlines the types of services that we are supposed to provide and the levels of each of those services. For example, we're supposed to provide hazmat services, and that's at the technician level. We're supposed to provide, trench rescue services, and that's at the technician level as opposed to an awareness level, right? And then in addition to those services, council has been clear on emergency response time targets. So in an urban setting, that would be, we have to get the first in unit there within a certain amount of time and the remainder of the effective firefighting force within a certain amount of time. And in our rural areas, we are supposed to have the first in unit responding within a certain amount of time and on scene within a certain amount of time, but not held accountable to the same regard as we are with an urban response footprint for the effective firefighting force. We still obviously try to muster the effective firefighting force for firefighter and public safety, but sometimes that's a little bit more of a challenge in a rural environment. But we will have career and volunteers respond together in many of our areas, our urban areas, our suburban areas, and our rural areas. As a matter of fact, we just staffed up a station 24 hours a day with a 4-person crew in what would have normally been a volunteer response area, largely for a few reasons. We developed a community risk model, which takes the historic call volume, the building infrastructure, the types of calls that we've responded to, and paints a community risk model. And based on the fact that we did not have a large amount of volunteers in that area, it painted that community as high risk. So it's color coded. And it does, like I said, take advantage of historical response data. And as a result of that analysis, we put a 24-hour crew, largely because there was a hospital in that community, there was an old age home in that community, and we needed the volunteers to have the support of a 24-hour 4-person crew to provide enough depth to meet those community needs. So every year we evaluate our responses from the previous year and say, is there something we need to tweak?
Using stats versus emotions, which is a great way. It's really the only way to do it. But unfortunately, so often many of our decisions are based upon emotions. We don't want to upset the volunteers and we don't want to upset the career. It really has nothing to do with that. It's about what's best for the people who are called 911 when they have their emergency. And clearly you're doing that. So your volunteers and career, do you have one command structure throughout the organization?
Yes, we do. So we have, obviously officers like any other fire department. So we continue to improve their training as an officer, and part of that training is obviously incident command. So when there is an incident, whoever is the first in officer who takes command eventually will try to get what we call here a district chief on scene, if at all possible. But we also have an on-call officer who's a member of our senior administration team, deputies and assistant chiefs, to provide more depth. Certainly, that's a little easier to get to in our urban footprint. Just to help people understand what I'm talking about with some of these challenges. For me to drive, so in our urban footprint, it's not quite in the middle of our geography, but at headquarters here where I'm participating in this call, if I were to get in my car and drive lights and siren as fast as I can drive safely to the far end of our response area, it would be, with lights and sirens, almost 3 hours. So that is a long area to respond, and that's in one direction. I still have the other direction. So if you're at one end of the area and get a call for the other, it's close to 5 hours. It is a long area to respond to. So we try to strategically locate our, command team so that we can provide depth. Inevitably, we will never have people in the right place all the time, but we certainly fall under one command structure to answer your question, and career and volunteer work on the same call interchangeably. We have minimum staffing that we provide on the career side that council has asked us to maintain. So that's kind of the bare minimum. We try wherever possible to staff up where we need for emergency events, hurricanes or bad storms or what have you. But we are expecting career and volunteer to emerge on those calls. The one challenge that we do have is, as we try to make decisions based on evidence, is having good data available and the accuracy of that data. So we continue to be challenged with our ability to accurately report our firefighters on scene in the volunteer sector, because we can make some assumptions in the full-time sector. Because we have a roster that says there's 4 people on that truck, 4 firefighters on that truck, we know when that truck shows up, it has 4 firefighters. That's not always the case in the volunteer sector. Some people show up in personal vehicles. Sometimes you have 3 on a truck. Sometimes you have 4. Sometimes you have 6, right? So those assumptions can't be followed. So it takes a lot more effort to go through those records to make sure that when we're reporting something, it's accurate. And quite proud of the team. This year we released our very first annual report. It's actually from 2019 because we had to kind of work out all the bugs. And very quickly, we'll be doing 2019 or 2020.
That report is available online?
Yes, it's on our website.
Okay, so we're going to, because we're obviously recording this, we're going to attach a link to that report to this broadcast so all of you can check out that report and kind of dig a little bit deeper if you're interested in what they're doing at Ken's department. Just from another quick question from a command standpoint, and I've always been, but really at this stage of my career, a student of command control, accountability, things like that. Are all of yours, let's just say first alarm assignment, structural fire of some type, are they all getting a battalion chief or someone of that rank responding with them? Or is it possible that perhaps a local volunteer chief will be commanding that incident?
So they would typically get a district chief respond to the call, along with a platoon captain, which would be our kind of incident safety officer. That responsibility resides with the platoon captain, with a certain number of engines, and if it requires tankers, and an aerial.
Very good. Very cool.
So we call them box alarms
Yeah,
here,
sure.
first alarm assignments, and we continue to look at that number of vehicles. So, for example, when I first came here, it was not necessarily consistent. So we created a standard response, like you're saying, a first alarm response. And after hearing staff input, they would, if they found it was a working fire, trigger another engine, and that meant the engine was getting there later than it would normally get there. And again, we didn't have the kind of same requirements for emergency response time targets before I got here. Now that we do everything that we can to hit that threshold. So one of the things we did is took that extra engine that was always asked after they had a working fire and added it to the first alarm. So now they don't have to ask for it. That doesn't mean they can't ask for something else. Incident commander can ask for, and if that's a company officer who's first on scene, and they're the incident commander until a district chief gets there, they can absolutely, make it a second alarm
Sure.
or ask for additional apparatus.
Halifax has had their share of major incidents, and of course, we talked about the explosion earlier. But more recently, Hurricane Dorian created some challenges. Can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, so Dorian was certainly exciting for somebody new to the Maritimes. We did have some unique responsibilities for Dorian. Not only are we, when I say we, HRFE, Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency, responsible for fire service delivery, we're also responsible for managing emergency management on behalf of the municipality. So during a large scale incident like that, or right now during the pandemic, we manage the emergency response on behalf of the CIO. So that authority is delegated directly from the CIO because the chief administrative officer is actually ultimately responsible for emergency management. So during Dorian, we opened up the EOC. Obviously, we put a storm response in preparation for Dorian, where we added extra capacity in our response, including the volunteer stations, where we staff up volunteer stations. So, because one of the challenges, whether it's a snowstorm or a hurricane, is if your volunteers can't get to the station because the roads aren't passable, they can't get out on the call. If they're in the station and the station is hardened, it has a generator or backup power supply, and a call comes in, they can go out as a crew, and they may need to open up roads with chainsaws or whatever to get down a road, but at least they can respond. If I'm trying to get into the station, I won't even be able to respond. So during storms like Dorian, it's not uncommon for us to take strategic volunteer stations, put out a request well ahead of time. Does anybody want to staff up a station? And if they do, we put them in service. We have an honorarium system where we pay them credits to, when they respond to calls. So they'll be compensated for that time. We would also do the same in our career sector, where we staff up trucks kind of above minimum complements in preparation for that. We also typically have storm model where, typically those types of incidents have many false alarms that come in because alarm systems go out of whack when the power goes out and there's a large amount of water. But after we did all that kind of regular work, very, very busy trying to not only support our critical emergency services, but others. So we were delivering fuel because we were one of the few people who could get out and about, deliver fuel for emergency water stations that could continue to keep the pumps running for their generators, provide fuel for generators for emergency shelters. So not only did our firefighters go out and respond to traditional emergencies, we did all kinds of non-traditional responses behind the scenes to make sure other people could keep doing their mission critical work. And during Dorian specifically, we had an incident here where a construction crane collapsed on a building that was under construction. Long story short, crew responded to that call. Nobody was injured, but we ended up having to put an emergency evacuation order in place for not only the building under construction, but also the buildings around it, because when it came down, it wrapped around the building under construction, and pieces of the building were unstable and possibly threatening other buildings. So again, during a hurricane, our crews are out there doing what they do, keeping our people safe. So certainly an interesting exposure to me for a hurricane world. I'm used to tornadoes coming from the middle of Canada. So a little bit similar, but certainly Dorian was my first major hurricane.
And I've reached out to you. You've certainly had some significant incidents, significant losses of life in dwelling fires and things like that. But you and your team, from looking what I was able to find, you created a program called the Road to Mental Readiness Training. Do I have that right? And can you share with us? And we're talking about firefighter behavioral health, which is on the between that and cancer and highway survival. Those are pretty much our biggies. But the Road to Mental Readiness Training, both tied to firefighters as well as family assistants. Share with us a little bit about what you've done and what brought that about and what successes you've seen.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to share on that. So we commonly refer to the Road to Mental Readiness as R2MR. So you might have heard that term. It certainly is not from the fire service originally. The Road to Mental Readiness program came out of the military, the Canadian military, and the Canadian military offered it up as an opportunity to partner with emergency services. So the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, Ken McMullen, Chief McMullen, was very involved in this, worked very closely with the military to take the content that was developed for military personnel and FireEyes it so that it was very audience specific. So when you take the training, they talk about examples that would happen in the fire service as opposed to, examples that would happen in the military. And
Sure.
the police have their version of it where they talk about police examples, and EMS has their version where they talk about it in a medical world. So after the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs had done all that work, there was a train-the-trainer program that was available. We had already had it in our strategic plan to roll out a train-the-trainer model in Halifax. But as you mentioned, we had a rough go for a couple of years where we had some high loss of life that really was taking its toll on our people. And we had a CISM team, even our CISM team was feeling the stress of supporting our firefighters. So we wanted to move the Road to Mental Readiness program down the track as quickly as possible. So we partnered with the CAFC and the Fire Service Association in Nova Scotia, which is like a fire chiefs association in Nova Scotia, to run a train-the-trainer model here. And we provided some candidates who took the training. Some others from Nova Scotia were here as well. One of Chief McMullen's master facilitator trainers, and another one from Edmonton under Chief Block at the time, offered to send two of those master facilitators here. We covered their expenses to come. They did, I believe it was a one week very intensive training program of our trainers, and left a legacy here where now we can train our own people. And for the last, it's been a little bit more difficult because of COVID, because a lot of this stuff is kind of interaction based, where you get together and, do those sessions face to face. But pre-COVID, we had been rolling out the R2MR program to everybody in our service. So every frontline provider would get that training. And part of that training is to give you some coping skills, but also the ability to see in your peers if they may be struggling, and offer a first level of support, and also identify in yourself when you might be feeling like you could use some support. And there's also training for family members, as you had mentioned as well. So we will continue down this journey. It's not a checkbox, you're done. It will be just part of our culture of continuous doing. But we need to kind of get through some of this COVID stuff to move it along. So we're still supporting our people the best we can. But once things open up a little bit, and we're hopeful that will happen in the next couple months, we'll be back in those face-to-face sessions.
And a tip of the helmet to Ken McMullen, another just phenomenal individual who's done some really, really good work for the North American Fire Service. And he represents, of course, the Canadian Fire Chiefs on the IFC Board of Directors. I want to cover two things before we wrap this up that we just sort of jumped into. You have a significant amount of immigration into Canada. And while we've certainly made headlines in the States with various issues related to immigration, in Canada, several of the fires that I've read about involve people who've come in from other countries. And we could probably spend hours talking about this, but what do you do to educate those when they're coming in from another country and their culture is so totally different from a fire safety standpoint? Maybe you could share a little bit about that, Ken?
Sure, if you don't mind. Before we get off the previous question, I was hoping to also share some great work done by members of our Family and Firefighter Assistance Program. So that R2MR program that I talked about is being run under the umbrella of our Firefighter and Family Assistance Program. So as mentioned, not just the R2MR program is available for staff and family members, but we have a whole area under our organization that is all around trying to take care of our people. So we call it our workplace culture pillar, part of our workplace culture pillar. And we have staff, a full-time member who's solely dedicated to supporting members who might require assistance. So not only are they responsible for the R2MR program and the CISM team, the Critical Incident Stress Management team, which is activated kind of after any significant event or anytime somebody wants assistance. We also have a member, full-time member whose job it is to support members. So members can go to that individual without going to management in full confidentiality if they're having many, many problems, which may be work related or maybe not. But if it impacts their ability to do their job, we want to make sure they're supported, because we honestly believe our staff are our most important asset. So if we can't support them, then we can't do our mission. So when I first started this position, I had shared in my introduction hello to people that you have a fire chief because you have a fire department. It's not the other way around. You don't have a fire department to support a fire chief, right? My job is to support our firefighters, and their job is to provide our mission to the community. So I truly and honestly believe that you need to take care of your people. So a large portion of our organizational structure is around supporting our people, keeping them well and healthy. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned
that's a big deal. I mean, you're using the old phrase, you're putting your money where your mouth is. I mean, you're living that mission, you're doing it, and that's a big deal. And I'm glad you did mention it.
So that does actually tie into the next piece that you talked about. And at least in my mind, it does. So yeah, there certainly is a large amount of immigration in Canada. And in this community in particular, this community, Halifax Regional Municipality, is the second fastest growing community in Canada right now. So we are challenged with keeping our infrastructure up to date, staying out. A large portion of our budget meetings with council over this last year, and there was a large turnover in council. And for the first time, we have diversity almost 50-50 in council with women and men and other diversity as well. A large amount of the questions we received this year with council was, how are you doing on the growth curve, right? So, if the community is growing at the rate of wide open, they're asking the director. So my other title besides fire chief is executive director. So they're asking the other executive director in charge of Parks and Recs, are you able to keep up with the need in Parks and Recs? Are you able to keep up with the roads? My question was, are you able to keep up with the growth? And based on the stuff that you will see in our annual report, you will see that, no, we were not able to keep up with the growth. We are not even where we should have been based on historical response data. So it is important that as a community grows, that you're out in front of the problems that will exist in a larger population, because there's more chances of having some of those challenges. And a large portion of the growth here, not all, but a large portion of the growth is immigration for a few different reasons. There's a lot of teaching institutions in this community. I think we have upwards of 5 universities within a couple hours of this office. So a large amount of people come here from outside the country, certainly outside the province, come here and see this evolving city that has a great culture, a good fabric, a beautiful location, and choose to stay here. So that's all great. So, we also, during the pandemic, have seen people choose to move here because, it has been one of the safest places in Canada to live during the pandemic. And with so many people working at home because of the pandemic, people say, well, if I can work from home, why not go work from home in Halifax, where the cost of living is cheaper? I can be on the ocean. It's a up and coming city, large metropolitan department or organization, or all the benefits of a large urban city. But also you can, 15-minute drive be in what looks to be cottage country. So it is a really cool area, and we have seen huge increase in the community's growth. So some of the things that we do to support immigration, when newcomers come to the community, we work closely with an organization called Fire Services FSANS, which supports newcomers. ISANS.
Is that a national group, or is that a provincial? Or?
No, it's a provincial group. Okay. It's called ISANS, not FSANS. Sorry, I misspoke. ISANS supports newcomers, and we partner with them wherever possible to go to events that they have, teach about fire safety. Sometimes English as a second language. We'll go to some of those classes and teach about fire safety. And we are talking about some cool, innovative stuff that's coming down the pipes that's kind of been put on the back burner because of COVID, trying to improve our relationships. But also there's a lot of interdepartment education and awareness about being an organization who is representative of our community, understands different cultures, and is received well by other cultures.
You mentioned, and that's where I want to go last, is to talk about your COVID response, both internally as well as with the community. But you made an interesting comment that I quickly scribbled down, that your community is among the safest places in Canada during COVID. Can you explain that and why?
So, well, we are a little bit isolated in that, besides coming in by air, it is kind of limited access. So if you take a look at the geography of Nova Scotia, it's almost like an island that is attached at a single point to the province beside us. So it is fairly easy to stop influx of people. Uh, but what I would say happened is the maritime provinces as a whole worked together to limit exposure of COVID. So they rapidly went into lockdowns when things, we're in a lockdown right now because we started to see a bit of a wave start to happen. So they locked down things quickly. The people in the communities were responsive to the public health orders. They wore masks, they did social distancing. People worked from home when they could work from home. And as a result, our waves were a lot smaller than a lot of other communities. And the Maritimes worked together, and we had a maritime travel bubble where if you lived in the Maritimes, you could travel amongst the Maritimes without having to isolate. But if you left the Maritimes and came back, you had to isolate for 14 days in your home before you could go out in the public. So that really allowed the Maritimes to support each other, both for business and economics, but also schools and stuff like that. But also allowed people some normalcy in their life. A bit of a challenge for those of us who have family in other provinces, because had I chose to travel outside the province, I would have had to isolate when I came back. But we have seen certainly an increase in this last wave, but is still, way less per capita than other provinces that are
that's what I was curious about. That's interesting. Now, Maritimes, just for the purposes of our audience, is basically the east coast of Canada, correct? Along the coast?
Yes. So that's typically PEI, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and some people call it Newfoundland as well. They're certainly Atlantic Canada, but the term maritime is usually New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia.
I see. Very good. How's your department? So we've established that clearly your numbers per capita are lower, and that's both due to effort as well as just the physical layout, the geography, which lend itself to better management of that. How's your organization doing as far as COVID? Your members, your personnel, things like that.
Quite proud of our members, both in the career sector and the volunteer sector, because of our model. Uh, if career members or volunteer members in their days off go into an area that there's a hot spot, and then they get identified at risk after they've been back to work by public health, that could have infected the career members in that station, but also the volunteer members in that station. So we put some pretty rigorous controls, limited, stations interacting together. You couldn't do training with another station when things were in total lockdown. And as things open up, we loosen our rules. But I'm very proud of the efforts of our people following the rules at work. But I would say, based on the data that we have, they're being very conscientious out of work, because we're not seeing a huge problem with our people coming into work having been exposed in the community. So I do believe they're not only taking it seriously at work, but they're taking it seriously when they're not at work, which certainly I commend them for.
I think that's a big deal, and we've seen that throughout North America. Is not as much worried about their exposure on duty as their behaviors off duty, and how they can manage that. And good for you. Well, listen, what a pleasure talking with you this morning, Ken. Any final comments or thoughts or words? You can. We really didn't talk much about the IFC. You'll have an opportunity, obviously, as you are taking the reins now and more formally take the reins this summer. But any thoughts regarding moving forward with the IFC as our leader?
No, what I did want to say is thank you for the work that you do on behalf of the membership with the Safety and Health Survival section, and certainly the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. Keep up the great work, Billy. I've been a fan of yours for longer than you and I have known each other. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our department. I'm quite proud of the men and women who work here, and I'm honored to be part of it.
it's very obvious when you talk about them that you beam about your family there, and meaning your Halifax Regional Fire and Emergency family. Well, thanks so much, Ken. And for those of you who are members of the IFC, keep a close eye. The IFC is moving in a very positive direction. And for those of you that are not, take a look at ifc.org and consider joining. There's opportunities for company officers as well as chief officers as well. And again, thanks to the crew, Amy and the crew at the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, Chief Ron Sarnicki, the executive director, for hosting these interviews at International Firefighters Day. I personally hope that this has helped all of us here in the United States get a little bit of international flavor. We spoke with Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, a fire chief over in the UK, and she provided some great insight. We spoke with Ben Barksdale, the fire chief of Orlando, Florida, who's very involved in the Africa Fire Mission, and he's sharing his story. And of course, this morning, spending time with my friend Ken Stuebing, sharing a little bit about what's going on in his organization and the Canadian Fire Service. To all of you joining us, have a good day. Take care of yourselves. Be safe. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.